Welcome back to the Reynolds Reveal. I'm your host, Morgan Reynolds, and if you would like to call, we do welcome such here at the Guerrilla Media Network. The number 218-862-9829. And 9/11, hey, that was a key determinant of U.S. policies, both domestic and foreign, in this century. And I am pleased to be joined by Abraham Heifetz Rodriguez, and he's been a very active and I think visible part of the 9/11 effort, the real effort to spread the truth about what a fraud 9/11 was, how basically the government has lied, the big lie has been on. So Abraham Rodriguez, welcome to the Reynolds Reveal. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Reynolds.
Hey, the first thing I wanted you to do is introduce yourself. I don't know a whole lot about you, but except that you were a medical student when you had your confrontation with Richard Gage, which I want you to address that. But so tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in 9/11 as well.
Sure. Well, I was born in Minnesota, in St. Paul, Minnesota, at St. Joseph's Hospital. Lived in Minnesota for most of my life and also in Iowa for most of my life. Eventually, I decided to move back to Iowa after bouncing back and forth with my family between Iowa and Minnesota for college. So I went to college at the University of Iowa, and I started to become very fascinated with science and the brain and just the amazing nature of the human body. And during my latter years at the University of Iowa, I started to become very concerned with what was going on in the world, mainly because I had all that opportunity to learn and to study and to pursue, whatever career I wanted, thanks to all the opportunities we have here in this country. And I started to become very concerned with the fact that we were in these wars, and 9/11 was one of the big excuses for these wars, which I still didn't understand and still didn't question at the time. But it was really with the 2008 presidential election when President Obama started to challenge his opponents that I really started to start paying attention to politics. And I will be honest, I'm not afraid to admit that as naive as I was, I actually liked and thought that Obama was going to follow through on the things he was saying. He was talking about ending the wars immediately, closing Guantanamo Bay, being against torture, being against warrantless wiretapping, and all these things that I was just sort of waking up to and starting to become concerned about. So I thought he was the answer, and I started to become very political and advocating for people to vote for him. And it was during that process that one of my more knowledgeable friends actually called me out. And I had always thought of myself at that point in time as being, kind of a scientific authority. I didn't really have a whole lot of friends who were as invested in research and scientific studying as I was. And so to have someone who stepped up bravely and called me out and said, you know what, you really think that this President Obama, if he gets elected, is going to change things, and kind of introduce the concept that perhaps presidents are more puppets than anything. It really challenged me, and I didn't really know what to make of it, but they provided me with some sources to start reading about things, and I ended up going to an alternative news website and just started reading about various concerns with multiple topics, and one of them was with 9/11. And
Abe, I've got a comment, if I could interrupt for a moment, and that is, apparently the Nobel Peace Prize Committee agreed with your naive assessment of Barack Hussein Obama, right? Gave him a Peace Prize before he was even in office, but that's how absurd things are. But go ahead on 9/11.
Sure, yeah, I agree. That's an interesting correlation there. So I continued to research, and I still thought that I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, so I continued to be political, and I continued to wake up more and more. And eventually, he was elected, of course, and then I got accepted to medical school. And I attended medical school at the University of Illinois, so I ended up moving to Illinois. And 3 of the 4 years of medical school were done in Peoria, Illinois, and that's where I eventually had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Richard Gage, which we'll get to later, like you said. But during that continual research process, I just became more and more understanding of the fact that at the very least we had not been told the truth about 9/11, and I was so sure of that because there's so many facts showing that we have not been told the truth. And I think that's something that most of us, especially listeners of this show, who are probably more aware of these issues than the average mainstream individual, can agree upon. There's no doubt that we were lied to and we have not been given all the facts. And so I became very concerned. I started speaking out about it. I found out about Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and Alex Jones and stuff like that. And I started to become supporters of those entities, but still trying to keep an open mind and still researching and learning more, things like alternative cancer treatments and whatnot. But eventually, things hit a crossroad when on Facebook one day I encountered a person who was saying, yeah, those Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth guys, they have some points and they raise some good information, but they're not telling you the whole story. There's a whole bunch of verifiable facts and information that you should also consider as well. And I hadn't really thought beyond that because I had never known that there was all these other facts. They certainly weren't listed on the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth website. They weren't even listed in most of the 9/11 Truth forums that I was active in at the time, including Pilots for 9/11 Truth, the James Randi forum. There's a whole bunch of different forums where they claim to be truth websites, but really don't have a whole lot of facts beyond just the typical.
Yeah, they're promoting half-truths at best. Were you a formal member of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth there, Abe?
Yeah, so being a scientific individual, that it was a big problem for me to not have a whole lot of scientific resources to present what I felt were extremely valid concerns with the events of 9/11 to other colleagues and fellow medical students. And, I wanted to talk with my professors about 9/11 who were teaching me the medical knowledge. But I mainly just had YouTube videos and alternative news site articles that were very credible, but they're easily, swept aside or not taken seriously by people that read peer-reviewed literature all day and are conducting randomized controlled trials in labs. So when I found out about the Niels Harrit, Dr. Stephen Jones paper that claimed to have found thermitic residue in the dust, I did find that pretty compelling. Obviously that didn't explain everything, but I felt like it was at least compelling enough that that was something I wanted to get behind and help to get out. So I ended up signing on to the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth petition. I started donating to them. I didn't have a salary or anything. I was just a medical student with student loans, so my donations were just out of my personal money, very minimal. I think totaling up to maybe $80 or $100 over the course of my, I think it was about 1 year membership in Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth.
So this is around what, 2010, the time frame?
Let's see. So in March of 2010 was when I started to realize that the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth website did not even have even a significant fraction of the available facts from 9/11 that you can go and understand and know about. And so that means that I must have signed on with them probably about spring of 2009 because I was a member for about 1 year. And trying to spread that information by posting in forums, emailing friends and family, presenting that scientific paper to various professors and other medical students of mine, handing out flyers for Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth on my campus. So it was about a year later that I had that encounter on Facebook where an individual said, well, yeah, they raised some good points, but there's a whole bunch of facts that are not even mentioned on their website that you really should take a look at because explosives do not explain this stuff. And so I started looking into all this information, and I started to realize that that person was absolutely right. And, if there's time, we can go more into it later, but just to quickly ramble off some of the pieces of evidence that I didn't see on that website that I found to be extremely important were things like the University of Alaska magnetometer data, the presence of a Category 3 hurricane, Hurricane Aaron, just off the coast of New York City on the morning of 9/11, the Columbia University New York City seismographic data that detected the rumbling in the ground as the buildings, slammed, quote, slammed to the ground. And that was actually very concerning.
Or didn't slam to the ground, right?
To see architects.
The seismographic data.
What was that, sir?
I say, the Columbia University seismographic data demonstrates that the buildings did not slam to the ground.
Yes,
Correct?
yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And
Well,
and
yeah. Continue down the things you discovered.
I hope there'll be more time to discuss some of these things in detail because they're very important. But that was one of the most compelling ones that I found was that seismographic data because architects are not necessarily scientists. Engineers do scientific research, but architects themselves are not scientists. But one piece of information that they are very qualified to analyze and speak about, and they tend to know more about than most other people in the world, is seismographic data, because when designing buildings, that's something that needs to be taken into account is earthquakes and the type of force that they can withstand to maintain their structural integrity. And so I thought the fact that this extremely important seismographic data that, like you mentioned, shows that there is a very, very small and short signal, much smaller, much quieter, and much shorter than one would expect if buildings were slamming to the ground for whatever reason, whether it's from a building toppling over, from gravity just crushing it, or whether it's from actually explosives being detonated to take out the supports, having the building come down that way. Neither of those situations added up with the seismographic evidence. It's far too quiet and far too fast to be explained by those things. And so I found it to be very concerning that information was not on the website. And at this time, I was still naive.
Okay, I've got to ask you now about Dr. Judy Wood's book. Came out in I think it was spring or late winter, early in 2010. So when did you discover Dr. Wood's work? Around about this time?
This was the time. This is what I'm kind of referring to, is when that person referred me to all of these other facts and pieces of evidence that were not found on the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth website. They were referring to me to the body of facts and information that Dr. Judy Wood has gathered. And so it was mainly through her website, since her book was not out yet at that time, that I was able to start learning about all these facts, such as the seismographic data. And so I grew very concerned about it. Just a couple other ones that I want to mention is the United States Geological Survey dust analysis. They took not only microscopic samples of the dust, but they also did overhead imaging using NASA's AVERISH instrument, thermal data from that instrument that flies overhead. They also took spectrometer images. There's these verifiable, hardcore scientific facts that everyone should know about, but for some reason they were not present on that website. So I grew very concerned, and I was naive, thinking that perhaps the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth people just did not know about them. So my next step was naturally to message Richard Gage about that and say, hey, I'm a donor. Hey, I'm a supporter. Do you know about all these facts? And if you do, like, why aren't they on the website? Like, can we get them on there, or is there a place where we can post them? And the result of that was that I never heard back from him. And I went to check on my account later on. I had not put any of this information in my profile because I was still unsure about it, and I was still processing it and still waiting to hear back from Mr. Gage and wanting to get his opinion on it, because I looked up to him at the time. And I never heard back from him. And when I went to check my profile on the account and see if maybe there was a reply from him, or maybe if some of these facts were now on the website, maybe he heard about them from me for some reason, I found out that I had been removed from the petition and that my account had been banned. And it had been done in silence. I didn't receive any type of warning or notification. I just was quietly swept under the rug for sending a private email to Mr. Gage that was not even public. I didn't post it anywhere. It was just between me and him. He never replied.
So what was your reaction?
I felt very betrayed, naturally, especially since, first of all, you expect this individual to either say, oh, wow, I didn't know about this stuff. Thank you so much. This is going to help the cause. We'll get this on the website right away, versus another type of response that I feel would have been appropriate would have been saying, oh, we know about this, but here's our opinion of it, or we don't think it's as important as the thermite residue, or some type of explanation for why it wasn't on there. I certainly didn't expect to receive no reply at all, and even more so, I certainly didn't expect that trying to help by sharing these facts with them, hoping to alert them to them, would result in me getting silently banned from the website, like an account completely removed, not temporarily suspended or silenced, but actually removed and deleted from the website.
Right.
Very
You were
concerning.
rationally expecting a content related response, right? To say that this
Yeah,
is appropriate for this reason and that, or we know about it, it's valid, but and we'll get on it. But instead, it's just you become a non-person. It's a Soviet response. We're going to delete you.
exactly. I found it to be very suspicious and very concerning. And so it kind of launched me on a crusade, you could say, for lack of better words, to push this information, because I started, as I continued to understand it more and more, I started to realize that perhaps the reason that they're behaving this way towards me is because perhaps this information is very important and shows that explosives as well do not explain this, just as well as jet fuel and airliners do not explain what happened on 9/11.
So,
So
Abe, were
I
you
continued.
catching on that this is part of the cover up, a deliberate disinformation, or you were maybe? I had this education, it's learning by doing, getting up this learning curve, that there is a cover up. Some people who are wearing white hats are actually black hat people. So, what stage of thinking were you at this point?
That was the first real inkling that I started to feel like, wow, maybe the cover up is not just at the level of, government officials telling lies and the news telling lies. This was the first time where I felt like here's a truth organization that is behaving in the exact opposite manner. They are doing the opposite of pursuing the truth. They are removing people for sharing facts and sharing verifiable information. And so I started to get suspicious. That's kind of where I was at that point. It became much more of a certainty that Mr. Gage is a dishonest individual later on, and I kind of tested things. So my next step was naturally to go to all these different 9/11 truth forums that I was an active poster at, some which I mentioned earlier. Even places like Loose Change, the Loose Change 9/11 forum. I thought that would be a great place to share this. And I started posting. I assembled kind of a compilation summary post, introduce these facts, and say, hey, what do you guys think about this? Let's discuss this. And this chain of events happened where I would continually have my account just removed and deleted and my blocking privilege or my posting privileges blocked just for making an innocent post about factual information that people need to know about. And so it started to become very clear to me after the pattern, after being banned from maybe 10, 11, 12 different, quote, truth forums like Loose Change for 9/11, Alex Jones's forum, etc., I started to realize that this is not just an accident. Like something that I'm posting is not, they don't want people to see that. And so I started to realize that this is indeed more than just suspicion, but this is deliberate trying to prevent people from seeing the information I'm sharing.
Boy, if you weren't an example of the wounded in this whole battle, it's just amazing, isn't it? But I want you to culminate in this. Tell us about this confrontation, or maybe you need more lead up. But that is a very noteworthy event. That personal confrontation. Tell us about that. It's on. It's
Sure.
one of your 104 videos posted on your YouTube channel. So listeners, check that out. The Abraham Heifetz Rodriguez YouTube channel. Tell us about it.
Yeah.
Abe.
The YouTube site is just youtube.com/Pooksta, which is spelled Pookzta. But that was just a result of me finding all these pieces of information that I wanted to get out there. A lot of them were available in the format of a YouTube video or another type of video that I was able to copy and share to my YouTube channel to try and bring awareness to the information. Like you asked, you want me to get towards the confrontation with Mr. Gage. So just a few more things to lead up to it very quickly.
Okay.
I started to become really certain about what was going on after the incidents that I mentioned, after AE911 Truth, where I started to get blocked by all of these various forums, such as Loose Change Forum, Alex Jones Forum, and whatnot. And then I went to Wikipedia because I thought, well, I'm a scientific person. I have a bachelor's in biology at that time. That was before I had finished medical school, of course. And I know that Wikipedia was supposed to be completely open and free for the public to edit things, and as long as they're factual and correct. So I made sure that my facts were correct. I made sure I had excellent sources, such as to the seismographic data, the University of Alaska data, all that information, as well as information about Dr. Wood's Supreme Court case where she actually filed this evidence in the court of law. And I tried to first create a page for Dr. Judy Wood to put her name on there. She didn't ask me to or anything like that. I made sure to contact her to get permission first. But I was so concerned about this information that I wanted to make sure I got a page with her name and her massive list of scientific credentials on there, as well as some of this information that she has found and put together for us to look at. And within just a few hours of creating the page, it got removed. And the reasons I was given by the Wikipedia moderators were completely false. They were saying things like, oh, this is not a credible source, but obviously this is indeed a credible source. Like, you can go to Columbia University Seismographic Institute and find this data raw from the source. You don't have to get it from a YouTube video or from an alternative news site or anything like that. And so they were saying one thing, but what they were saying was not adding up with the truth. And so I continued to try and appeal, and I had no success. They continued to give me the same responses. And so then I went to the Wikipedia 9/11 Truth Movement page, because Wikipedia is not against discussing 9/11 conspiracy theories, but they are against letting Dr. Wood's name or any of these actual facts that are not theories be mentioned on there. So I found that they had all this information about people like the researcher named David Ray Griffin, who I believe his PhD is actually in theology or religious studies. He's not even a scientist.
Right.
But they have all of these paragraphs devoted to him and his book and Dr. Stephen Jones and thermite. But there is absolutely no mention of Dr. Judy Wood, not even so much as having one small link to her website on the list of supplemental sources on that 9/11 Truth Movement Wikipedia page. And this just fit with everything else. So I thought I'd be sneaky and try to slip in her website at the bottom and just slip in a sentence or two.
Arguably, I insist she's done the most important volume in the century thus far. I mean, Where Did the Towers Go is such there's been no attempt to refute the facts in that book.
No, and I agree with you. It's not really an irrefutable thing, because the facts are the facts. They speak for themselves. And the only way people can really attempt to give the illusion that it's been discredited is to either distract from it or to just address individual isolated little segments of it and try to create arguments about that. But when you look at all of the facts together, it is so overwhelmingly obvious. It just makes you want to yell at the top of your lungs, like, look, people, like, you can actually know what happened on that day. You do not have to guess about it anymore. So that's why I try to emphasize the importance of the evidence. So, but like you can suspect, after I added her small little website link and a couple of sentences about her to that 9/11 Truth Movement page, thinking maybe they would accept of her mentioning there, that got removed. So there was someone actively monitoring that page, because within just a few minutes, or even I think within the first hour of just slipping that on there, they had already deleted that link and deleted the 2 or 3 sentences I had added with her name. So I went through the appeal process. I provided sources. I provided facts to back up what I was saying. I provided her list of credentials to show that she is definitely a well-qualified scientist to be talking about this type of stuff. And they were giving me the same runaround. Eventually, because I would not let it go, and I kept saying, the reasons you're giving me are not adding up, they actually just banned my account and closed the appeal. And there's a Wikipedia policy that reports that discussions are to remain open for a certain amount of time. I think it's like 5 to 7 days, so that enough public moderators can come in and weigh in, so you get a diversity of opinions and get a more fair vote. But this small group of moderators decided to shut it down basically within a few hours. And so they violated their own policy in their censorship of me. And so this was just more affirmation to me and confirmation that there is a coordinated effort to try and prevent the public from learning about these easy to understand and easy to verify hard pieces of empirical data. and show us what happened on 9/11. So that's kind of the buildup that led me to eventually question Mr. Gage in person, which is what you wanted me to do. So,
talk about that. Of course, you have a video of this confrontation that's about isn't it as much as 10 or 11 minutes? But let's hear it live from Abe. What happened?
Okay. Yeah, you're right. It is. I was able to. It's a two-part video. So I found out that architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, in their tour, you could call it, where different, someone was paying for Richard Gage to move around and give talks in various cities. And one of the cities he was going to be stopping at happened to be the city where I was doing 3 of my 4 years of medical school, Peoria, Illinois. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity to question him about this. This actually was in April of 2011. So this was after Dr. Wood's book was out. This was after I had a much better understanding of the facts. I'd gone through the information several more times by that point. And so I wanted to question him in person and ask him questions, not to humiliate or anything vengeful, but actually just to see how he would respond when I would bring up these facts that he was refusing to address when I emailed him initially, and see how he would respond when he had the public staring at him, because he wouldn't be able to, divisively just quietly walk away from it like he did when they banned my account silently from their website. So I went to that presentation, and I had a friend come with me who filmed it. And it's 2 parts, because the first part is when I asked him questions during the standard Q&A session at the end, where they pass around the mic to various people in the audience that have questions. And then because I didn't really get a good answer to my question, I was able to stick around at the end of the show while they were cleaning up, and I was able to ask him the rest of what I wanted to ask. And he got the whole thing on tape, and his responses are really unbelievable. I won't try to describe everything in detail, because I encourage people to...
Give us 1 or 2 points of data that come to mind. Yeah,
so the questions I asked him why all of these important facts, such as the New York City seismographic data and some of the other things I've mentioned so far, why those aren't even found on his website, and why he doesn't even mention them in his presentation. But he does mention all of these subjective testimonial pieces of evidence, which are much weaker forms of evidence. We all know that the telephone game, where you say something to a friend and they whisper it in their friend's ear, and eventually by the time it comes back around the circle, you have an entire different story from when you started. And that's because testimonial evidence is a very weak form of evidence, because it's prone to bias, it's prone to mistakes, it's prone to different misunderstandings people have, and those mistakes can get passed on when someone gives their testimony. So in science, the gold standard of evidence is empirical evidence, which is evidence that you can observe with your own senses and verify with your own senses, so that you can draw your own solid conclusions about it. So that's like things that you can see.
Perhaps aided by instrumentation as well, of course. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Like performing a study and having data where you can say, oh, yes, that molecule did move 2 degrees to the left. I can see that right there. I agree with you. It's not someone telling you what they saw. You can actually see it for yourself, or witness it for yourself and verify it.
Yeah, it's about reality. Amen.
What was that?
I say it's about reality. That's a synonym for the truth. This is real.
Exactly. Yeah. It's reality testing, empirical evidence. Exactly. So I asked him that, why don't you have these facts on your website, and why don't you even mention them in your presentation? And, his response, which I encourage you to look for the full response yourself, he basically said that he doesn't have enough time, and they're trying to focus on the most, quote, rock-solid forensic evidence, which is a direct contradiction to what I just asked him, because what I asked him is why he's not sharing the most rock-solid forensic evidence, the empirical evidence.
Yeah, that's a lie.
He tried to make it sound pretty good. If you listen to him, he puts like a sleazy little twist on it that tries to make it sound to the unknowing public that there's a good reason for why he doesn't share certain bits of information. I think the next question was Yeah, I don't remember exactly every question. One question was about why he has not pursued a court case like Dr. Judy Wood has. It's this thermite papers, so smoking gun. You know, and he gives the excuse that he doesn't have enough time, and no one in the organization has enough time, even though he's affiliated with James Gorley, who I believe is a high-ranking individual, the executive director of the International Center for 9/11 Studies. So he has the resources around him. He has people who have the legal knowledge, who have the finances. So it was very strange that he's not filed this evidence in a court of law, but ultimately the big part of the
all my praise to you, Abe Rodriguez, for this revelation, that this exposure of who Gage is and what his organization is really all about.
Yeah, well, no problem at all. I'm just doing what's right. You know, I hope that any other concerned individual will take the facts forward and not be afraid to question whoever, whether it's a teacher they have at school or their parents or anyone that they feel deserves to know the truth. So,
well, I encourage our listeners to check out Abe Rodriguez. We've got 104 available, most of them short videos on YouTube, and educate yourself. Now, Abe, we don't have much time left, so I know you want to talk a little bit about methodology and what people can do to inform themselves and think this through for themselves.
Okay. I just wanted to mention one last thing about the confrontation with Mr. Gage, and then I'll quickly move on.
Okay.
Because the most important part with the confrontation came during part 2, when I was able to approach him one-on-one at the end of the talk. Once a lot of the people had left and trickled out, there was an opportunity for me to reapproach him, because he, as you'll see in the video during part 1, he cuts me off quite a bit, so I was never really able to finish asking him the tougher questions. So in part 2, when I got to him one-on-one, I started to ask specific questions like, you know, you're an architect. Why don't you at the very least, talk about the New York City seismographic data? And that's when he actually said out loud, and it's on videotape, he says, I don't understand the New York City seismographic data. I've never studied it.
Yeah, he said he's not a seismographer. And here he is, an architect in San Francisco, where, hey, earthquakes do occur.
Yeah, exactly. And even if he wasn't an architect, the point is that the greatest point is that he's an individual claiming to present the most rock-solid forensic evidence, even though he's not, and even though he admits that he hasn't even studied the most important evidence, which is the rock-solid forensic evidence that everyone can agree upon by just going to the New York Columbia University Seismology Group's website and checking out the seismographic data from 9/11. And the second part that was very, very concerning to me of the second confrontation was when I asked him, well, how come you don't talk about other things as well, like the 1,400 plus mangled and warped cars? And he said to me that he says to me that I don't know what can explain that. He says this on video. He goes, I don't know what can explain that, after I mentioned the cars. And then he goes on to say, I don't want to ask questions that will just make people ask more questions. I want to ask questions that will motivate people to ask for a new investigation. And it's just unbelievable to hear someone admit on tape that the very...
You know how many, with the original Pearl Harbor in 1941, the so-called surprise attack by the Japanese, you know how many investigations there were by different committees and the Defense Department, or well, the War Department then? There were nine investigations. Now, we've had probably as many as a half dozen, right, with 9/11. And here it is, basically the government's investigating itself. So truths do actually escape with this cloud of words, but that whole thing is just a fraudulent way to go from a policy point of view. What to do? We as Jesse Ventura says, there's enough meat on this bone to begin prosecutions. That's what we really need.
There is, and that's why Dr. Wood's court case got all the way to the Supreme Court in October of 2009 before the judge dismissed it without hearing it, because cases that are nonsense, they don't successfully get appealed to that level. They get dismissed way down low on the food chain. And so you've got to have a lot of evidence behind what you're saying in order to make it that far. And I fully agree with what you just said, because there is a lot of meat on the bone here. There are so many verifiable facts that you can know, and to actually just understand what happened to the building on that day without having to speculate or theorize about it. So it was just amazing to hear Mr. Gage specifically say, in addition to the fact that he hasn't studied certain bits of evidence that are very, very important, to also say, I don't know what can explain that piece of evidence, literally admitting that the thermite explosives nonsense that he just promoted at this presentation I was at does not explain all of the evidence. No. Yet he claims that it does. And so it was just amazing. And it's on videotape. If you just search for the video, it's called Richard Gage Questioned at AE911 Truth Presentation. And the date is April 12th, 2011. That's when it happened. So, you know, you can see that for yourself.
Now, you've got videos on a lot of other aspects of 9/11, the Hutchison effect, the Boyd Bushman, Stephen Jones and Niels Harrit. One I just watched was about the psych experiment, how peer pressure can lead to different behavior than when you're decision making alone. But out of all those videos, which ones kind of come to mind as important for our listeners to go look at?
Well, that's a tough question to answer because there's quite a few. But if I had to just choose one, I would say that the most important video on my entire YouTube channel is the one that is the cover of my channel, which is just an unedited, high-definition, slow-motion clip of WTC-1, the second tower to go down, turning to dust in midair. And it is high-definition, close-up, crystal clear, in slow motion. So you can watch that thing and pick out a steel beam and just watch it disappear in midair. It literally disintegrates.
It's only isn't it only a minute and 12 seconds? It's pretty brief, but it's very impressive for those who aren't aware of these towers being turned to fine powder.
Yeah, exactly. And you can also see the aluminum cladding that was on the exterior of the building that's popped off because those pieces are much smaller in size and they're all grouped together because they all were on the outside. You can see how those are completely unaffected. There's no large dust trails coming off of those. It's just these large steel grids that are arranged in Chex-like patterns, almost like Chex Mix cereal or wheat Chex, as Dr. Woods refers to their appearance. You can specifically see those are the things that are just turning to dust in midair. And some of them you can actually see completely turn to dust before they pass down to the bottom of the screen. And it's mind-blowing. It really is.
It is. And that's part of our problem in terms of breaking through, because they used black technology, secret or semi-secret, both the airplane frauds and the destruction of all or part of the 7 buildings of the World Trade Center. It's fantastic. It was a fantastic event. As Jerry Leapart, our attorney in our 9/11 cases, said, it just didn't make any sense, this whole thing. And of course it doesn't, because the whole government story makes no sense. You scratch it anywhere superficially and it all turns to dust because it's all a lie. So in closing, Abe, I think yours is a great resource. It's a great story. I admire your courage in pursuing the truth against all these obstacles. And so what would you advise? How should people proceed in educating themselves and maybe becoming activists like you?
Well, let's see. I think the first step is to just understand the facts, because without the facts, you yourself won't actually know what happened. And I know it's hard. It takes time to read and to watch videos and to look at pictures and graphs and to learn about them. But honestly, if you really care, then that's the first step you got to take, is to know what happened for yourself so that you can help other people to know. Because there's a lot of clout, there's a lot of disinformation, there's a lot of distracting and confusing information. So if you can try and cut through all that and actually just look at the facts and go to the sources, don't just look at Dr. Wood's website, even though it is extremely well referenced and very, very credible. Take it even further. Go to the sources that are provided and actually go to the usgs.gov website and the Columbia University Seismographic Institute, Seismology Institute's website, and actually look at that seismographic data raw from their website. And that's really what helped it sink in for me. And it is so overwhelmingly conclusive, this body of evidence, that it is not a theory and it's not a hypothesis. And it's very troubling to see so many people still referring to it as such, because it's an incorrect statement. And I just wanted to share something really quick to kind of close from my end to help articulate why that is, because a lot of people don't have the scientific understanding to know when something is not a theory anymore or not a hypothesis anymore, for example. So just wanted to share that theory, speculation, and belief are not necessary to understand that directed energy was used on 9/11. Rather, only detailed study of the empirical evidence from 9/11 is necessary. Situations like this are rare in science, I'll admit, when there's so much empirical evidence that one can actually bypass the process of theorizing and speculating to instead draw an irrefutable conclusion from that evidence. And this is actually a major difference between Dr. Wood and other researchers, is that she did not lead with a theory and try to fit evidence to her theory or find evidence to support it. She simply gathered as much of the evidence from 9/11 as she could, everything from weather to the dust samples to witness testimonies, everything, and then put it all together and said, okay, what is this? What can we conclude from this? And so what you'll find is that it is irrefutable and conclusive that there is nothing else that even comes close to explaining all this evidence, not any type of destructive force at all, whether it's kinetic energy like wrecking balls or gravity, or thermal energy like an explosive or thermite or nuclear warheads even. None of those things even come close to explaining this evidence, but directed energy weapons explain it with overwhelming conclusiveness. And there's a quick little analogy that I wrote that was inspired by Eric Larson, Dr. Eric Larson, to write, that helps to explain what that means to people. So just put yourself in this theoretical example for a second. So please consider this example. It helps to illustrate the difference between a conclusive body of evidence versus a theory or hypothesis. So pretend that I had my attorney provide you with the following verified and certified factual evidence. I own a common household pet. It's a mammal. It has 4 legs. It has sharp teeth. It eats meat. It has lots of hair. It barks very loudly. It drools when I place food in front of him. He wags its tail when he gets excited. He eats from under the table. He often chases cats. He barks at the moon. He can be trained to do many tricks, including sit, stay, and roll over. He can play fetch. He has a strong sense of smell. He's often used by law enforcement to fight crime. He's often used for hunting, to retrieve and flush out game before the game is shot. He's closely related to wolves. He's a domesticated animal derived from wolves, and he's also known as man's best friend. So based on that factual information that I just provided you with, you can irrefutably conclude without theorizing or speculating that I own some type of dog, because there's no other possible explanation that even comes close to accounting for all of those verifiable facts I just gave you to describe my pet. You don't need to theorize, you don't need to speculate, you don't need to guess. You simply have to review all of those facts that I gave you and know them in detail to know beyond any reasonable doubt that I own some type of dog. Now, you can only conclude that I own a general category of animal known as a dog. You can't say it's a brown dog or it's a Labrador, because you didn't have enough facts to go that far. That would be theory or speculation. But you can at least irrefutably conclude without theory or speculation that I own a general category of animal known as a dog. And that analogy is exactly related to 9/11, because the evidence is that overwhelmingly conclusive. If you just take the time to understand it, you can know that some type of general category of weapon known as a directed energy weapon was used to turn those buildings mostly to fine dust in midair before they ever hit the ground. And it's very hard for me to say that to colleagues and stuff, because they don't understand the evidence. So, but I have no problem saying that anymore, because I understand the evidence that well that it's irrefutable. And so that's why when you ask me what can people do? I encourage them to first try and understand the evidence as much as you can before you try and go raising awareness about it, because a lot of people are not going to wake up to a simple YouTube video or a quick little news article. They're going to want the facts. And so try and understand the facts first.
And then another analogy that I know Dr. Wood uses is it's a forensic investigation, and it's like doing an autopsy, a very thorough autopsy that is irrefutable. And the cause of death was a bullet, a blunt object blow to the skull, or a slashed throat, or whatever. But there's no theorizing or hypothesizing involved once you've I had this assembly of all the known authentic evidence. So
yeah,
I thank you very much, Abe Rodriguez, for all you've done in the cause of the real truth about 9/11. I admire what you've done and your courage, and I hope you continue on and the best in your studies and completing your MD program.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Reynolds, and thanks for everything you've done, too. I really appreciate it.
Abraham Hafiz Rodriguez, go to his YouTube channel and get bite-sized video proof of the 9/11 lie, right? Gave him a Peace Prize before he was even in office, but that's how absurd things are. But go ahead on 9/11.
Sure, yeah, I agree. That's an interesting correlation there. So I continued to research, and I still thought that I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. So I continued to be political, and I continued to wake up more and more. And eventually, he was elected, of course, and then I got accepted to medical school. And I attended medical school at the University of Illinois. So I ended up moving to Illinois, and 3 of the 4 years of medical school were done in Peoria, Illinois, and that's where I eventually had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Richard Gage, which we'll get to later, like you said. But during that continual research process, I just became more and more understanding of the fact that at the very least we had not been told the truth about 9/11. And I was so sure of that because there's so many facts showing that we have not been told the truth. And I think that's something that most of us, especially listeners of this show, we're probably more aware of these issues than the average mainstream individual can agree upon. There's no doubt that we were lied to and we have not been given all the facts. And so I became very concerned. I started speaking out about it. I found out about Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and Alex Jones and stuff like that. And I started to become supporters of those entities, but still trying to keep an open mind and still researching and learning more, things like alternative cancer treatments and whatnot. But eventually, things hit a crossroad when on Facebook one day I encountered a person who was saying, yeah, those Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth guys, they have some points and they raise some good information, but they're not telling you the whole story. There's a whole bunch of verifiable facts and information that you should also consider as well. And I hadn't really thought beyond that because I had never known that there was all these other facts. They certainly weren't listed on the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth website. They weren't even listed in most of the 9/11 Truth forums that I was active in at the time, including Pilots for 9/11 Truth, the James Randi forum. There's a whole bunch of different forums that claim to be truth websites, but really don't have a whole lot of facts beyond just the typical.
Yeah, they're promoting half-truths at best. Were you a formal member of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth there, Abe?
Yeah, so being a scientific individual, it was a big problem for me to not have a whole lot of scientific resources to present what I felt were extremely valid concerns with the.
Welcome back to the Reynolds Reveal. I'm your host, Morgan Reynolds, and if you would like to call, we do welcome such here at the Guerrilla Media Network, the number 218-862-9829. And 9/11, hey, that was a key determinant of U.S. policies, both domestic and foreign, in this century. And I am pleased to be joined by Abraham Hafiz Rodriguez, and he's been a very active and I think visible part of the 9/11 effort, the real effort to spread the truth about what a fraud 9/11 was. How basically the government has lied. The big lie has been on. So Abraham Rodriguez, welcome to the Reynolds Reveal. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Reynolds.
Hey, the first thing I wanted you to do is introduce yourself. I don't know a whole lot about you, but except that you were a medical student when you had your confrontation with Richard Gage, which I want you to address that. But so tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in 9/11 as well.
Sure. Well, I was born in Minnesota, in St. Paul, Minnesota, at St. Joseph's Hospital. Lived in Minnesota for most of my life and also in Iowa for most of my life. Eventually, I decided to move back to Iowa after bouncing back and forth with my family between Iowa and Minnesota for college. So I went to college at the University of Iowa, and I started to become very fascinated with science and the brain and just the amazing nature of the human body. And during my latter years at the University of Iowa, I started to become very concerned with what was going on in the world, mainly because I had all that opportunity to learn and to study and to pursue, whatever career I wanted, thanks to all the opportunities we have here in this country. And I started to become very concerned with the fact that we are in these wars, and 9/11 was one of the big excuses for these wars, which I still didn't understand and still didn't question at the time. But it was really with the 2008 presidential election when President Obama started to challenge his opponents that I really started to start paying attention to politics. And I will be honest, I'm not afraid to admit that as naive as I was, I actually liked and thought that Obama was going to follow through on the things he was saying. He was talking about ending the wars immediately, closing Guantanamo Bay, being against torture, being against warrantless wiretapping, and all these things that I was just sort of waking up to and starting to become concerned about. So I thought he was the answer, and I started to become very political and advocating for people to vote for him. And it was during that process that one of my more knowledgeable friends actually called me out. And I had always thought of myself at that point in time as being, kind of a scientific authority. I didn't really have a whole lot of friends who were as invested in research and scientific studying as I was. And so to have someone who stepped up bravely and called me out and said, you know what, you really think that this President Obama, if he gets elected, is going to change things, and kind of introduce the concept that perhaps presidents are more puppets than anything. It really challenged me, and I didn't really know what to make of it, but they provided me with some sources to start reading about things, and I ended up going to an alternative news website and just started reading about various concerns with multiple topics, and one of them was with 9/11. And
Abe, I've got a comment, if I could interrupt for a moment, and that is, apparently the Nobel Peace Prize Committee agreed with your naive assessment of Barack Hussein Obama.